A poor girl saves an injured millionaire in the woods. The next day, the girl unexpectedly brings along a strange man to take the millionaire away. The cabin was barely a cabin, more like a skeleton stitched together with desperation. Its walls leaned slightly, as if bowing to the weight of years of neglect. Inside, the air was damp, thick with the smell of wet wood and the faint medicinal tang of herbs simmering in an old pot. Claire lay on a cot near the only window, her breath labored, rasping faintly with every inhale. Joan knelt by the stove, feeding the weak flame with splinters of bark and whispering to herself, a habit she'd developed when silence grew too heavy. Her voice was a quiet tether, keeping her anchored to something steady. "I'll find more firewood," she said, glancing at her mother. Her words hung in the room like a thin veil, fragile, but there. Claire stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Not too far, Joan," she murmured, her voice frayed and barely audible. "The forest, it doesn't forgive carelessness." Joan nodded as she swallowed the knot in her throat. "I won't go far," she promised, but she always went farther than she said. She had to. The woodpile by the cabin was nearly gone, and the forest, though beautiful, gave nothing away easily. She stepped outside, the early morning chill biting at her cheeks. Forest Park loomed around her, its dense trees swaying gently in the breeze. The path ahead was uneven, strewn with roots and damp leaves. Joan walked cautiously, her small feet light against the forest floor. Her worn boots made soft imprints in the mud, and she paused every few steps to listen. It wasn't just hikers or rangers she feared. The forest had its own rules, its own dangers. She clutched the small knife strapped to her belt, a relic of her father's, long gone now, and whispered a quiet prayer to herself, though she wasn't sure who was listening. Her eyes darted to every flicker of movement, scanning for signs of hikers, or, worse, the rangers. She knew the forest well enough to navigate its trails undetected, but fear kept her sharp. One mistake could mean discovery, and finding out would mean eviction. The deeper she ventured, the darker it became. The trees here grew closer together, their canopy blotting out much of the pale sunlight. Joan scanned the ground for fallen branches, bending occasionally to pick up a promising piece. Her hands were scratched and cold, but she kept moving. A sound broke through the stillness, a sharp, guttural noise that froze her in place. Her breath hitched as she clutched a branch she'd just picked up, holding it like a shield. The sound came again, this time louder, more desperate. It was a cry, raw and primal, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of something large moving through the underbrush. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crouched low, her fingers trembling slightly against the rough bark of the branch. She waited, ears straining, but the forest fell silent again. The sound had come from somewhere to her left, just beyond a dense thicket. She knew she should turn back, but curiosity and an unfamiliar pull pushed her forward. The thicket was thick with thorny vines, and Joan used her knife to cut a narrow path through. The air here was heavier, and the scent of something metallic lingered faintly. She held her breath as she crept forward, every step careful and deliberate. When she emerged from the thicket, the sight before her made her gasp softly. A man lay sprawled near the base of a tree, his body slumped awkwardly against the roots. Blood soaked the front of his torn shirt, pooling on the ground beneath him. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, and his eyes were half open, glazed and unfocused. Joan froze, her mind racing. He wasn't one of the hikers or rangers she usually avoided. His clothes, though bloodied, were too fine. Dark slacks, a tailored shirt, and a gold watch glinting faintly against his wrist. She stepped closer, her small frame almost invisible in the shadows of the trees. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave him, but something in his faint, shallow breathing made her pause. The man's lips moved weakly, though no sound came. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a struggle. Joan crouched low, her knife gripped tightly in one hand, her other hand hovering near his shoulder. "Who are you?" she whispered, though she didn't expect an answer. An eerie stillness replaced the usual rustle of leaves and bird calls in the forest surrounding them. The man's eyes flickered, just barely meeting hers. "Help!" he rasped, the word so faint it could have been a ghost's sigh. Joan drew back slightly, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't know who he was, but she knew what she had to do. Still, fear gripped her, fear of what helping him might bring, of what secrets he might carry. The forest seemed to lean in closer, as if watching her decide. Joan swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the knife. She stood there, frozen, caught between the pull of her conscience and the weight of her fear. And then, with a shaky breath, she whispered, "Wait here." The man didn't respond, his head lolling to the side. Joan turned back toward the thicket, her legs trembling as she prepared to run. Not away, but toward the cabin. Joan ran, her small frame darting through the underbrush with practiced precision. The thorns she had carefully avoided on her way in now scratched at her arms and legs, but she paid them no mind. The man's pale face and bloodied shirt were etched into her mind, a sharp, unrelenting image that pushed her forward. The cabin appeared through the trees, slouched and unassuming, as though it wanted to remain hidden just as much as its occupants did. Joan burst through the creaking door, startling Claire from her light doze. "Joan?" Claire's voice was a rasp, weak and edged with alarm. "What's wrong?" Joan didn't answer immediately. She threw open a wooden crate near the stove, rummaging for the cloth scraps and small jar of salve they used for cuts and scrapes. Her hands shook as she worked, the sound of her shallow breathing filling the room. "Joan, talk to me," Claire said, her tone firmer now. She struggled to sit up, propping herself on one elbow. "What's going on?" "There's a man," Joan said finally, her words spilling out in a rush. "In the forest. He's hurt. Badly. I think he was attacked by something." Claire froze, her face tightening. "A man? What kind of man? Did he see you?" "I don't know," Joan replied, clutching the supplies to her chest. "He's not a ranger, though. His clothes. He's someone important, I think." Claire's expression darkened. "And you left him there?" "I had to come back for these," Joan said, her voice rising slightly as she gestured to the supplies. "I couldn't just leave him like that." For a moment, Claire said nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze flicked toward the open door, as if expecting the man to materialize in the threshold. Finally, she sighed, sinking back onto the cot. "Be careful, Joan," she murmured, "and don't bring trouble back with you." Joan hesitated, her mother's words heavy in the air, but there was no time for doubt. She turned and ran out the door, the supplies clutched tightly in her hands. When Joan returned to the clearing, the man was still slumped against the tree, his head tilted at an awkward angle. For one terrible moment, she thought she might have been too late, but then his chest rose in a shallow, labored breath. Relief and fear surged through her in equal measure. Kneeling beside him, she placed the supplies on the ground and gently touched his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Can you hear me?" Joan asked, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. The man's lips moved, but no sound came. Joan didn't wait for an answer. She tore a strip of cloth from the bundle and poured water from her canteen over it, then began wiping the blood from his chest. Beneath the torn fabric of his shirt, a jagged wound stretched across his ribs, raw and angry. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, not yet. But it needed to be cleaned and bound quickly. "This is going to hurt," she warned, though she doubted he could comprehend much of what she said. Carefully, she pressed the damp cloth to the wound. The man flinched, a low groan escaping his lips, but he didn't pull away. "Hold still," Joan murmured, her hands moving with surprising confidence for someone so young. She worked quickly, applying the salve and wrapping the wound with strips of cloth. The bandage was crude, but it would hold. With the worst of the bleeding stopped, Joan tried to lift him to his feet. He was heavier than she expected, his weight sagging against her small frame. "You have to help me," she said, her voice strained. "Just stand up a little. Please." The man grunted, his legs trembling as he pushed against the ground. Slowly, awkwardly, they managed to get him upright. Joan looped his arm over her shoulders, her knees nearly buckling under the effort. The journey back to the cabin was excruciatingly slow. Every few steps, Joan stopped to adjust her grip or let the man rest against a tree. The forest seemed more alive now, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through her. "Just a little farther," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her breaths came in quick, shallow bursts, her muscles screaming with the effort. When the cabin finally came into view, Joan nearly collapsed with relief. "We're here," she said, though the man's head lolled against her shoulder, offering no response. She pushed the door open with her foot, guiding him inside. Claire's eyes widened as they entered, taking in the bloodied stranger leaning heavily against Joan. "Joan," Claire whispered, her voice tight with alarm. "What have you done?" "He needs help," Joan said simply, her tone resolute. She eased the man onto the cot by the stove, her arms trembling from the effort. Claire sat frozen for a moment, her gaze darting between Joan and the man. Finally she sighed, her weariness evident in the slump of her shoulders. "Get some water boiling," she said quietly. "Let's see what we can do." Joan nodded, moving quickly to obey. The room felt smaller now, the presence of the stranger filling it with unspoken questions. But for the first time in a long while, Joan felt a spark of hope. They had a chance, however small, to save someone. The cabin felt more vulnerable than usual, its walls barely shielding the outside world. Joan moved quickly, the faint warmth of hope still flickering within her, though her muscles ached from carrying the man. She poured water into the dented kettle, her hands trembling as she lit the stove. The fire crackled weakly, filling the room with an uneven glow. Claire's sharp eyes never left the stranger on the cot. Her frail frame was perched on the edge of her own bed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you certain about this, Joan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above a whisper. Joan nodded, kneeling to rummage through their meager supplies. "We couldn't just leave him," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "He was dying." Claire sighed deeply, leaning back against the wall. Her hand moved to her chest, as if the weight of her words pressed down on her too heavily. "And now he's here. If he wakes up and he's trouble—" "He won't be," Joan interrupted, her tone more certain than she felt. She set the jar of salve and clean rags on the small wooden table by the cot and glanced at the man. His breathing was shallow but steady now, his chest rising and falling beneath the crude bandages she had tied. Claire didn't respond, her expression unreadable. Joan could sense her mother's skepticism, but chose not to push. Instead, she focused on the man, whose face had softened in unconsciousness. Despite his features being bloodied and lined with age, they seemed out of place in their rugged cabin. His tailored shirt, now torn and stained, hinted at a life far removed from their world. Hours passed in near silence. Joan worked with quiet efficiency, boiling herbs to make a crude antiseptic tea and tending to the man's wounds under Claire's watchful gaze. At times, Claire's hands shook too much to hold the needle steady, but she insisted on stitching the deeper cuts herself. Joan stayed close, offering whispered encouragement. "Who do you think he is?" Joan asked as she wrung out a cloth and laid it across the man's forehead. The question had lingered in her mind since she'd found him. Claire didn't answer immediately. Her tired eyes studied the man's face, her fingers hovering uncertainly near the edge of his bandages. "Someone with money," she said, finally, her tone clipped. "That watch on his wrist isn't something people like us can afford." Joan nodded, though the thought didn't comfort her. If he was wealthy, that meant he might have powerful friends, or enemies. She stared at the man, wondering what had driven him so deep into the forest. By the third day, the man stirred. His groan was low and hoarse, breaking the fragile quiet of the cabin. Joan leaned forward, her hand gripping his arm lightly. "You're safe," she said, her voice calm despite the tightness in her chest. "You're in our home." The man blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused. He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Where?" His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "Forest Park," Joan explained. "We found you in the woods. You were hurt." He took a few shallow breaths, his eyes finally meeting hers. There was something searching in his expression, as though he were trying to piece together how he'd ended up here. Gerald. Gerald Jones," he said, the words slow and strained. Joan nodded, glancing over her shoulder at Claire, who was watching, silently, from her cot. "I'm Joan. That's my mother. Claire." Gerald's gaze flickered to Claire, his brows furrowing slightly, but he didn't speak again. Instead, he closed his eyes, his exhaustion pulling him back into unconsciousness. The next time he woke, Gerald's voice was stronger, though his movements were still slow and deliberate. He thanked them softly for their help, his tone genuine, but it wasn't long before his gratitude turned to urgency. "I need to get back," he said one evening, his voice cutting through the quiet as Joan placed a fresh bowl of broth on the table beside him. He struggled to sit up, his face pinched with pain. "I have a family. They'll be looking for me." Joan hesitated, glancing at Claire. Although her mother's expression was unreadable, the tension in her body conveyed a powerful message. "They can help you," Gerald continued, his eyes locking onto Joan's. "I just need to get word to them. My wife. She'll send someone." "How?" Claire asked, her voice sharp. "We can't just walk into the city and announce we've been hiding someone. Do you realize what that could bring down on us?" Gerald's expression softened, though the urgency in his tone remained. "I have an address," he said, pulling weakly at the pocket of his jacket. "If you take it to them, I swear they'll help you. Both of you." Joan's hand tightened on the edge of the table, her mind racing. She wanted to trust him, but the risk loomed large. Finally, she glanced at Claire, waiting for her mother to decide. Claire exhaled slowly, her fingers curling into her lap. "Joan." She paused, her voice heavy. "If you go, you're on your own." "I'll go," Joan said without hesitation, her voice quiet but firm. She looked at Gerald, her resolve hardening. "Give me the address." The man nodded weakly, his gratitude evident in the faint curve of his lips. For Joan, the spark of hope had returned, brighter now, but no less dangerous. The sky was grey, overcast with the heavy promise of rain, as Joan stood at the edge of the forest, clutching the slip of paper Gerald had given her. His handwriting was jagged, each letter betraying the shaking hand that had written it. The address felt weighty in her palm, like it carried the fate of her world. She glanced back toward the trees, where the familiar cocoon of shadows seemed to call her back. But there was no turning back now. Her first steps onto the paved road were hesitant, the soles of her worn boots slipping slightly on the smooth surface. The path into Portland stretched ahead, curving toward a world she had only seen from afar. The towering buildings that loomed in the distance made her chest tighten with both awe and apprehension. Cars roared past in metallic flashes, horns blared in discordant rhythm, and strangers brushed by her on the sidewalk without a glance. Joan kept her head low, her fingers gripping Gerald's card so tightly that the edges bit into her skin. Every sound seemed magnified, every face unfamiliar. She stopped at a busy intersection's corner, her heart pounding as she attempted to understand the confusing array of lights and signals. People moved with purpose, their strides quick and confident. Joan's small frame felt almost swallowed by the mass of bustling bodies, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her feet ached by the time she reached the neighborhood Gerald had described, West Hills. The noise of the city began to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of wealth. The houses here weren't houses at all, but sprawling estates, their manicured lawns and wrought-iron gates standing in sharp contrast to the wild chaos of the forest she called home. Joan's steps faltered as she approached the largest of them, its grand facade looming like a fortress. The gate was heavy and imposing, with intricate designs that seemed to mock her simplicity. Joan pressed the buzzer hesitantly, her finger hovering for a moment before she pushed it. A tinny voice crackled through the intercom. "Who is it?" The tone was clipped, vaguely irritated. Joan leaned in, her voice trembling slightly. I need to speak with Stephanie Jones. It's about Gerald." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched out uncomfortably, and then the gate clicked open. Joan slipped through, her heart pounding as she walked up the long driveway. The air here was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that carried judgment. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a woman who could only be Stephanie. She was tall, with sharp features and a neatly pressed blouse that seemed to mirror the severity of her expression. Her eyes swept over Joan, taking in her disheveled appearance, the mud on her boots, the threadbare jacket that hung loosely over her small frame. "Who are you?" Stephanie's voice was cold, each word laced with suspicion. "I'm Joan," the girl said, her voice barely audible over a whisper. "Gerald, he's hurt. I helped him. He sent me to find you." Stephanie's gaze hardened, her arms crossing over her chest. "And where exactly is my husband?" "In the forest," Joan said quickly, clutching the card tighter. "He was attacked. My mum and I have been taking care of him, but he needs help. He said you could—" Stephanie's laugh cut her off, sharp and humorless. "So let me get this straight. You expect me to believe that Gerald is lying injured in the middle of nowhere, and somehow you just happened to find him?" Her eyes narrowed. "What are you after, little girl? Money?" Joan's cheeks flushed, her hands trembling. "I don't want anything," she said firmly, though her voice quivered at the edges. "He gave me this." She held out the card, her fingers reluctant to let it go. Stephanie snatched it from her, her eyes scanning the handwriting. Something flickered across her face. Doubt, fear, or maybe recognition. But it was gone, as quickly as it had appeared. She looked back at Joan, her expression unreadable. "If you're lying," she said slowly, "you'll regret it." Joan's jaw tightened, her resolve hardening. "I'm not." Stephanie stared at her for a moment longer before sighing sharply. "Wait here." She disappeared into the house, leaving Joan standing awkwardly on the pristine porch. When she returned, a man in a dark suit trailed behind her. "This is Malcolm," Stephanie said, gesturing to the stoic chauffeur. "He'll take you back to where you claim Gerald is, if you're telling the truth." Her voice softened for the first time, though it still carried an edge of doubt. "We'll see." Joan nodded, her grip tightening on her jacket as she followed Malcolm to a sleek black car parked near the house. She climbed in, the soft leather seats beneath her feeling foreign and out of place. The ride back to the forest was silent, the tension heavy in the air. Joan stared out the window, the familiar trees drawing closer with every mile. Her heart raced as she thought of Gerald, of the cabin, of Claire waiting anxiously. She glanced at Malcolm, who sat stiffly behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. "He's really there," she said quietly, as if to reassure herself as much as him. "We'll see," Malcolm replied, echoing Stephanie's words. The sleek car crept along the uneven dirt path, its polished exterior utterly out of place against the tangled roots and overhanging branches of the forest. Joan sat stiffly in the back seat, her fingers gripping her knees. Malcolm's impassive face reflected in the rearview mirror, his silence as heavy as the tension pressing against her ribs. Every jolt and bump of the car felt like a question. What if they don't believe me? When the cabin came into view, Malcolm's sharp inhale was the only sound. In the daylight, the small structure appeared even more fragile, its patched walls leaning like a tired figure clinging to its existence. Malcolm brought the car to a stop and stepped out, smoothing his immaculate suit as he surveyed the scene with a mix of skepticism and distaste. Joan didn't wait for him. She slipped out of the car and hurried toward the door, her boots crunching against the forest floor. The familiar sense of damp wood and smoke welcomed her as if they were old friends. Pushing the door open, she found Claire sitting by the cot where Gerald lay, her weary face tightening as she registered Malcolm's presence behind Joan. "What's this?" Claire's voice was low but edged with suspicion, her eyes darting between Joan and the suited man standing in the doorway. "They're here to help," Joan said quickly, stepping closer to her mother. "Gerald's wife, Stephanie, sent him to see if it's true." Claire's expression darkened. "And what if they decide we're not worth the trouble? What happens to us then?" Joan knelt by her mother's side, lowering her voice. "We can't keep him here, Mom. He needs a doctor. And—" She hesitated, her words careful. "They said they'd help us too." Claire's gaze lingered on Joan's face, her resolve wavering. The fear she carried was etched into every line of her features. Fear of being exposed, fear of losing what little they had. But Gerald stirred on the cot then, his groan breaking the standoff. "Claire," he rasped, his voice faint but steady enough to cut through the tension. "She's right. I need to go back. Come to the city. I guarantee you will be safe and better." Claire looked at him for a long moment, then back at Joan. Finally, with a deep, reluctant sigh, she nodded. "Fine," she murmured, "but I'm not leaving this cabin unless I know it's safe." Malcolm worked quickly, his movements efficient but clinical as he assessed Gerald's condition. With Joan's help, they managed to lift him into the car. Gerald winced at every motion, but his gratitude shone through in small, fleeting smiles directed at Joan. Claire hesitated at the door, her hands gripping the frame as though the cabin itself were anchoring her. "This place," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Joan reached for her mother's hand, her touch firm. "It's not safe here anymore," she said softly. "We'll be okay, Mom. They'll help." After a long moment, Claire nodded. She gathered the few belongings they could carry, an old shawl, a pouch of herbs, a battered tin cup, and followed Joan out into the clearing. Malcolm was waiting, holding the car door open, his expression unreadable. As the car began the slow journey back to West Hills, The contrast between their world and Gerald's became painfully apparent. The cabin disappeared behind them, swallowed by the shadows of the forest, while the smooth roads of the city stretched ahead. Claire sat stiffly in her seat, clutching Joan's hand as though it were the only solid thing in a shifting world. The drive felt endless, the silence thick with unspoken fears. Gerald drifted in and out of consciousness, his shallow breaths filling the space. Joan watched the city grow closer through the window, the buildings rising like mountains out of concrete. For the first time, she saw West Hills with Gerald's eyes, its manicured lawns, the glint of wealth that seemed both dazzling and suffocating. When the car pulled up to the gates of the Jones estate, Joan's stomach twisted. The grandeur of the mansion loomed even larger than before, its imposing facade framed by pristine gardens. Malcolm stepped out and opened the door for Claire, who hesitated for a beat before allowing him to help her. Stephanie was waiting at the entrance, her sharp features unreadable as her gaze landed on Gerald's slumped figure. Her arms were crossed, her posture rigid. "Is he alive?" she asked, her tone clipped but tinged with something that might have been fear. "He'll be fine," Malcolm replied, "but he needs proper care." Stephanie's eyes flicked to Joan and Claire, her scrutiny slicing through them. "And them?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "They're the reason he's still alive," Malcolm said simply, stepping aside to let Joan and Claire follow Gerald into the house. Stephanie said nothing, her gaze lingering on Joan for a moment longer, before she turned sharply on her heel and disappeared into the house. As the heavy doors closed behind them, Joan glanced back toward the car. The forest felt a world away now, its shadows replaced by gleaming marble and polished wood. Her chest tightened as she thought of the cabin, of the life they'd left behind. She didn't know if this new world would hold the answers they needed, or if it would swallow them whole. But when Joan looked at Claire, still clutching her tin cup as though it were a lifeline, she straightened her shoulders. Hope, no matter how fragile, was worth holding on to. The mansion's interior gleamed with cold perfection. Polished marble floors stretched out beneath towering ceilings adorned with intricate chandeliers. Every surface seemed to shimmer, reflecting a world that was pristine and unyielding. Joan's boots squeaked against the floor as she stepped hesitantly forward, her eyes darting between gilded mirrors and walls lined with heavy, ornate paintings. Claire stayed close, her hand gripping Joan's arm, her gaze fixed downward, as though afraid to touch anything with her eyes. Stephanie's heels clicked against the floor as she strode ahead, her posture stiff with annoyance. She led them into a sitting room, its furniture too pristine to look comfortable. The air was thick with silence until she turned sharply, her arms crossed over her chest. "Gerald," she said, her tone edged with exasperation, "what exactly possessed you to bring them here?" Gerald, seated gingerly on a velvet armchair with Malcolm's help, winced as he adjusted his injured side. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. "They saved my life, Stephanie," he said, each word deliberate. "If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be here." Stephanie's eyes flicked to Joan and Claire, her expression unmoving. "And now what?" she asked, her voice clipped. "They're just supposed to stay here, forever." "For now," Gerald replied firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Until they're on their feet." Stephanie's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she turned her attention to Joan, her gaze cutting. "There are rules in this house," she said sharply. "You'll stay in the guest quarters, and you'll keep out of the way, understood?" Joan nodded quickly, her voice caught in her throat. Claire's grip on her arm tightened. "Good," Stephanie said curtly, turning back to Gerald. "You need rest, and I'm going to make sure you get it. As for them," her voice trailed off as she gestured to Malcolm, "show them to the guest rooms." The guest quarters were smaller than the grand rooms Joan had seen on their way in, but they were unlike anything she had ever known. The bed was soft, layered with clean white sheets, and a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. A small lamp cast a warm glow over the room, though the walls were bare. Joan sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. Claire stood by the window, staring out at the meticulously trimmed hedges and fountains below. "We don't belong here," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Joan looked up. "We'll stay out of the way," she said, her tone firm despite the unease curling in her stomach. "It's just for now." The next day, Joan wandered cautiously into the kitchen, hoping to find something small she could bring back to Claire. The staff bustled around her, their movements precise and efficient. Joan hovered near the doorway until one of them, a kind-faced older woman, handed her a piece of bread and a small glass of milk. Joan offered a quiet thank you and carried the items back to the guest room, careful not to spill a drop. Stephanie found her later, dusting a corner of the sitting room with a cloth she had discovered under the sink. "What are you doing?" Stephanie's voice was sharp, making Joan jump. "I just wanted to help," Joan said quickly, clutching the cloth. Stephanie's eyes narrowed. "We have people for that," she said coldly. "If you want to be useful, stay out of sight." Joan tried to heed Stephanie's words, but the tension only grew. One afternoon, she sat at the dining table, carefully sipping from a teacup, when she accidentally picked up the wrong spoon. It wasn't just any spoon, it was one of Stephanie's prized silver pieces, set aside for display rather than use. Stephanie's voice pierced the silence sharply. "What do you think you're doing?" Joan froze, the spoon clutched in her hand. I didn't know," she stammered, her cheeks flushing crimson. Stephanie snatched the spoon from her hand, inspecting it as though it had been irreparably damaged. With a look of disdain, she walked to the trash bin and dropped it in, the sound of the metal hitting the bottom ringing out like an accusation. "Now it's ruined," Stephanie said, her voice icy. She turned her back on Joan without another word. Joan stared at the trash bin, her heart pounding. Humiliation burned in her chest, but she swallowed it down, her hands curling into fists at her sides. That night, Joan sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. "I was just trying to help," she said softly, the words barely audible in the quiet room. Claire, lying on the other bed, turned her head toward Joan. "You don't have to prove anything to her," she said gently. "Just keep your head down, and we'll get through this." Joan nodded, but the knot in her chest didn't loosen. The mansion, with all its grandeur, felt less like a refuge and more like a gilded cage. Still, she whispered to herself the promise she'd carried since the forest. "I'll protect her, no matter what." The house settled into silence around them, but Joan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking on a fragile thread, one misstep away from falling into a darkness they couldn't escape. The days in the mansion unfolded in a quiet rhythm of tension and unease, each moment sharpened by Stephanie's cold presence. Joan quickly learned the unspoken rules of the house, rules that seemed designed to keep her and Claire invisible. Meals were eaten in the kitchen with the staff, a small round table set away from the gleaming dining room where Stephanie and Gerald dined in formal silence. Joan didn't mind eating in the kitchen. The staff, though reserved at first, softened toward her. Mrs. Kent, the head cook, occasionally slid an extra slice of bread or an apple across the counter to her with a kind smile. Joan helped where she could, scrubbing pots or sweeping the floor, eager to show her gratitude. The staff didn't protest, though they cast wary glances toward the door, as if Stephanie might appear at any moment. One morning, Joan decided to dust the sitting room while Stephanie was out. She worked quietly, careful not to disturb anything. The room was filled with fragile, ornate pieces that felt like they belonged in a museum. Her hands trembled as she wiped the edge of a porcelain vase, its intricate blue patterns gleaming in the light. Her concentration broke when she heard a sharp gasp behind her. Turning, she saw Stephanie standing in the doorway, her expression a mask of fury. "What are you doing?" Stephanie demanded, her voice slicing through the air. Joan froze, the cloth slipping from her hand. I was just cleaning," she stammered. Stephanie stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She picked up the cloth and dropped it onto the nearest table with deliberate disdain. "We have staff for that," she said coldly. "Do not touch anything in this room again. Is that clear?" Joan nodded quickly, her cheeks burning. She hurried out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Despite Stephanie's admonitions, Joan continued to find small ways to help around the house. It gave her a sense of purpose, something to do beyond sitting in the guest room and listening to Claire's wheezing breaths. One afternoon, as she carried a tray of water and towels for Gerald, her foot caught on the edge of the rug. The tray tipped, the glasses shattering against the marble floor. The sound echoed loudly, drawing Stephanie from the adjacent room. She appeared within seconds, her sharp features twisted in anger. "What have you done?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing at the mess on the floor. "I'm sorry," Joan said quickly, crouching to pick up the broken glass. "Leave it," Stephanie barked. "You're going to hurt yourself. Just get out of the way." Joan stepped back, her hands shaking. Stephanie called for one of the maids to clean up the mess, dismissing Joan with a sharp wave of her hand. "Next time, don't take on tasks you're not capable of handling," Stephanie said, her tone dripping with disdain. Joan's face burned as she fled the room. The tension reached its peak one evening at dinner. Joan sat in the kitchen with the staff, eating quietly as the others spoke in low murmurs. She had just finished her meal when Mrs. Kent handed her a small dish of pudding, a rare treat. "Go on," the cook said kindly. "You've earned it." Joan smiled shyly and took the dish to the sink, where she found a clean spoon resting on the counter. Without hesitation, she picked it up and started eating. Minutes later, Stephanie stormed into the kitchen, her gaze locking onto Joan. In her hand was an identical spoon, its polished surface gleaming. "Where did you get that?" Stephanie demanded, her voice icy. Joan looked down at the spoon in her hand, confusion flickering across her face. "It was by the sink," she said softly. "I didn't know." "That's not just a spoon," Stephanie snapped. "That's part of a silver set that's been in my family for generations. And now you've contaminated it." Joan's stomach sank as Stephanie snatched the spoon from her hand. Without hesitation, she crossed the room and dropped it into the trash bin. The sound of the metal hitting the bottom was deafening in the silence that followed. "Don't touch what doesn't belong to you," Stephanie said, her voice low and sharp. She abruptly left the kitchen, leaving Joan frozen in place. That night, Joan sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. The humiliation of the day clung to her like a heavy cloak. Across the room, Claire watched her silently, her frail frame propped against the pillows. "You don't have to keep trying to please her," Claire said softly. "It won't change anything." Joan looked up, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "I'm not doing it for her," she said. "I just want to help." Claire sighed, her expression softening. "You have a good heart, Joan, but don't let them break it." Meanwhile, in the quiet hours of the evening, Stephanie lingered outside a locked door at the end of the hall. Her hand rested on the doorknob, but she didn't turn it. Instead, she stared at the polished wood, her face unreadable. Behind her, the mansion's grandeur seemed to close in, its silence heavy with unspoken pain. Whatever lay behind the door, it was a secret Stephanie wasn't ready to share. Not with Gerald, not with Joan, not even with herself. Downstairs, Joan whispered to herself in the dark, repeating the words that had become her mantra. I'll protect her, no matter what. The house settled into stillness, but beneath its surface, tensions churned like a storm waiting to break. That night, the mansion was unusually quiet. Gerald had not returned from his work, and the house felt the weight of his absence. Joan lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, her mind restless. Across the room, Claire slept fitfully, her breathing shallow and uneven. Joan was just beginning to drift off when a sharp noise jolted her upright, a muffled crash followed by hurried footsteps. She froze, straining to hear. The sounds grew louder, shuffling, the clinking of metal, and the low hum of voices. Something was wrong. Sliding out of bed as quietly as she could, Joan moved toward the door. "Stay here," she whispered, glancing back at Claire. Her mother didn't stir. The hallway was dark, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the tall windows, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Joan crept toward the source of the noise, her heart pounding in her chest. As she neared the sitting room, she saw movement, a flicker of shadows against the far wall. Joan crouched low, peeking around the corner. 3 men in dark clothing were rummaging through cabinets and drawers, their movements quick and deliberate. One of them carried a crowbar, which he used to pry open a locked chest. The others were focused on a glass display case filled with jewelry, their gloved hands carefully selecting pieces and stuffing them into a bag. Her breath caught in her throat. Burglars. For a moment, she considered running back to the guest room, locking the door, and waiting for the intruders to leave. But then she remembered Stephanie, likely asleep upstairs, unaware of the danger. Joan's pulse quickened as she weighed her options. She couldn't just hide, not when someone might get hurt. Swallowing her fear, Joan grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table. The cold metal felt solid in her hands, grounding her trembling fingers. She stepped into the room, her small frame hidden by the shadows. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice shaking but loud enough to startle the men. They turned in unison, their faces obscured by black masks. For a brief moment, silence hung heavy and sharp. Then one of them stepped forward, his voice low and menacing. "What are you doing here, kid?" Joan gripped the candlestick tighter, her knuckles white. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Now." The man laughed, a cruel sound that sent chills down her spine. "And what are you going to do? Stop us?" Without thinking, Joan lunged at the closest man, swinging the candlestick with all her strength. It connected with his arm, causing him to drop the bag of jewelry he was holding. He cursed loudly, clutching his elbow, and turned on her with fury in his eyes. The second man grabbed her by the arm, his grip like iron. Joan struggled, kicking and writhing, but he was too strong. In the chaos, the candlestick fell from her grasp, clattering to the floor. "Stupid brat," the man growled, yanking her closer. Joan bit down on his hand as hard as she could, and he yelped, letting go just long enough for her to stumble backward. But as she turned to run, the third man swung his crowbar, catching her arm. Pain exploded through her body as she fell to the ground, clutching her bleeding arm. Upstairs, Stephanie woke to the commotion. She threw on a robe and hurried down the stairs, her heart racing. When she reached the sitting room, the sight before her made her freeze. Joan was on the floor, blood staining the sleeve of her nightgown. The intruders loomed over her, but their attention snapped to Stephanie as she entered. "Who are you?" one of them barked, but Stephanie didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on Joan, who was trying and failing to sit up. Something inside Stephanie broke. Memories flooded her mind, her daughter, her small body lying motionless after the accident, blood pooling around her. The image of Joan now, injured and vulnerable, was too much. Tears blurred her vision as she rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Joan. "Leave her alone!" Stephanie shouted, her voice raw with panic and fury. She cradled Joan's head in her lap, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. "Take what you want. My jewelry is in the top drawer. Just leave us alone." The burglars hesitated, startled by the sudden ferocity in her tone. Before they could react, the blaring sound of sirens filled the air. One of the maids had called the police, and the flashing red and blue lights outside sent the intruders scrambling. They bolted through the back door just as the first officers stormed into the house. The chaos subsided quickly. The burglars were caught before they could flee far, and the police secured the house. Paramedics arrived to tend to Joan's injury, wrapping her arm in clean bandages. It wasn't as bad as it had looked, but the blood loss had left her pale and weak. Stephanie stayed by her side, her usual composure shattered. She held Joan's hand tightly, her tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, over and over, her voice thick with guilt and grief. "I'm so sorry." Joan looked up at her, confused by the sudden warmth in Stephanie's touch. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice faint. "You're safe." But Stephanie shook her head, the weight of her past regrets pressing down on her. For the first time, the walls she had built around herself cracked, revealing the pain she had carried for so long. Upstairs, the locked door remained closed, its secrets still hidden. But in the sitting room, something fragile and new began to take root, a bond forged in blood and vulnerability, its edges sharp but hopeful. Joan blinked against the fluorescent glare of the hospital lights, her mind foggy and her arm throbbing beneath layers of fresh bandages. The steady beeping of machines and the soft murmur of voices filled the sterile air. She shifted slightly, her head turning toward the figure slumped in a chair beside her bed. Stephanie sat there, her elegant frame folded in an uncharacteristically awkward position. Her hair was loose, falling in disheveled strands around her face. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, which were red from hours of crying. In her hands, she clutched Joan's small, uninjured hand as though it were a lifeline. Joan stared at her, confused. This wasn't the sharp, cold woman she had come to expect. Stephanie looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Joan saw something in Stephanie's gaze she hadn't noticed before. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "I'm sorry," Stephanie whispered, for what felt like the 100th time, her voice cracking. "I should have..." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You shouldn't have had to face them alone." Joan opened her mouth to respond, but her throat felt dry. Instead, she squeezed Stephanie's hand weakly. The gesture seemed to undo Stephanie further, and she pressed her forehead to their joined hands, tears spilling freely. The door creaked open, and Gerald stepped into the room. His suit was rumpled, his face pale and drawn, as he took in the scene before him. He froze, his gaze shifting between Joan's pale form on the bed and his wife, visibly breaking down beside her. "Stephanie," he said softly, his voice a mixture of shock and concern. She lifted her head, wiping her face hastily, as though embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "Gerald," she murmured, her voice hoarse. He approached the bed, his movements hesitant. His eyes rested on Joan, and his expression softened. "How are you feeling, Joan?" he asked gently. "Tired," Joan whispered, her voice barely audible. Gerald nodded, his jaw tightening as he glanced at her bandaged arm. "You're very brave," he said. "What you did. You saved us." Joan gave a faint smile, though her eyes fluttered shut as exhaustion tugged at her. Stephanie looked at Gerald, and for the first time, in what felt like years, there was no frost in her gaze. "She saved me," Stephanie admitted, her voice trembling, "and I've treated her so horribly." She let out a shaky breath. "Gerald, She faltered, the words tangling in her throat. I don't deserve her forgiveness. Gerald reached out, resting a hand on Stephanie's shoulder. It's not about deserving, he said quietly. It's about making it right. Over the next few days, Joan's strength began to return, though her movements were slow and deliberate. Stephanie rarely left her side, tending to her with a quiet determination that surprised everyone, including herself. She brushed Joan's hair, adjusted her pillows, and fetched whatever small comforts the girl needed without being asked. Her guilt lingered in every gesture, but her care was genuine. Joan noticed the change. Stephanie's sharp edges had softened, her voice gentler, her words less biting. It wasn't a complete transformation. Stephanie still carried her rigidity, her control. But something deeper had shifted. Joan noticed hints of warmth and humanity, and she started to relax her guard. One afternoon, as Stephanie fluffed the pillows behind Joan's back, Joan reached out and touched her hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Stephanie froze, her eyes widening slightly. "You're thanking me?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Joan nodded. "You've been kind," she said simply. "And I am not mad at you." Stephanie's breath caught, and she sank into the chair beside Joan's bed, her hand covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time there was a glimmer of relief in them. Meanwhile, Claire's health continued to decline. Despite the care she received in the mansion and from the hospital staff, her frailty deepened. She grew quieter, her movements slower, and her coughs more frequent. Gerald noticed and gently suggested additional treatments, but Claire waved him off with a tired smile. "Don't fuss over me," she said one evening, her voice faint but steady. "I've made my peace." Joan overheard the conversation from the doorway, her stomach twisting. She approached her mother's bedside, kneeling beside her. "You'll get better," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "You have to." Claire cupped Joan's face with one frail hand, her touch warm despite her cool skin. "My sweet girl," she murmured, her eyes shining. "You've always been so strong. But it's okay to let go." Joan shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. Stephanie, standing silently in the corner, watched the scene unfold with a heavy heart. For the first time, she saw the depth of Joan's love for her mother. The fierce, unyielding devotion that had driven her through every hardship. It stirred something deep. Stephanie, a longing to protect what little time they had left. The hospital discharged Joan after her recovery, and she returned to the mansion. But the house felt different now. The tension that had once suffocated its halls had eased, replaced by an unspoken truce. Stephanie was still Stephanie, blunt, exacting, but her treatment of Joan and Claire had shifted. She no longer snapped at them or dismissed them as intruders. Instead, she made quiet efforts to include them, sharing small stories or offering hesitant smiles. The change was slow, fragile, but it was there. Joan saw it in the way Stephanie lingered by Claire's bedside, offering her tea or fluffing her pillows. She felt it in the way Stephanie looked at her now, with something that almost resembled pride. For the first time since stepping into the mansion, Joan felt a glimmer of belonging. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And as she sat by her mother's side, holding her hand tightly, she whispered the same promise she always had. "I'll protect her, no matter what." This time, though, she knew she wasn't alone. 2 years passed like the steady turning of pages, each chapter marked by quiet resilience and fleeting moments of joy. The mansion, once cold and imposing, had grown into a space where warmth could occasionally be found. But even in its grandeur, the inevitability of time pressed down heavily. Joan sat by Claire's bedside, her hand wrapped around her mother's frail fingers. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting shadows along the walls. Claire's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with labored effort. She looked smaller than ever, her features delicate and worn, but there was a peacefulness in her expression that eased some of Joan's fear. "Joan," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Joan leaned closer, her heart aching at the sound of her mother's words. "You've been my light through all of this. You've given me more than I could have ever hoped for." Tears streamed down Joan's cheeks as she shook her head. "No, Mom. You've done everything for me. You can't leave me." Claire's frail hand moved to Joan's cheek, her touch light but comforting. "You'll never be alone," she said, her voice steady despite its softness. "You have a family now. Gerald and Stephanie. They'll look after you. I can see it." Joan sobbed quietly, clutching her mother's hand as though holding on could stop time. "But I need you," she whispered. Claire smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I'll always be with you, my sweet girl. Always." And with that, Claire's breathing slowed, her chest rising one last time before stillness enveloped her. Joan felt the air grow heavier, her tears falling freely as she pressed her forehead to her mother's hand. The days following Claire's passing were a blur. The house seemed quieter than ever, its halls echoing with absence. Joan moved through it like a ghost, her grief weighing her down. Gerald and Stephanie watched her with concern, their own sorrow mingling with a newfound sense of responsibility. One evening, as Joan sat on the floor of the sitting room, clutching an old shawl that had belonged to her mother, Gerald approached her. He knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Joan," he began, his voice soft but firm. "You've been through so much, and I know there's nothing we can do to fill the void your mother left. But Stephanie and we want to be here for you. We want you to be part of our family." Joan looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. "You mean, you want to adopt me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Gerald nodded. "If you'll let us, we want to give you a home, a future. You deserve that." Joan hesitated, her heart conflicted. The pain of losing her mother was still raw, but in Gerald's eyes, she saw sincerity and a quiet strength that reassured her. She nodded slowly, a small spark of hope igniting within her. "Okay," she whispered. The adoption process moved quickly, Gerald and Stephanie's resources ensuring no delays. When it was finalized, Joan stood in the same grand sitting room where she had once felt so out of place. This time, Stephanie stood beside her, her hand resting lightly on Joan's shoulder. "I'm not perfect," Stephanie admitted quietly, her voice tinged with emotion. "But I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you." Joan looked up at her, a faint smile breaking through her grief. "Thank you," she said simply, her words carrying a depth of gratitude that Stephanie felt in her chest. As time passed, Stephanie's relationship with Joan deepened. Her initial awkwardness in showing affection transformed into a fierce protectiveness. She no longer flinched at Joan's touch or hesitated to offer a kind word. Instead, she became a steady presence in Joan's life, guiding her with a firm but loving hand. Stephanie often found herself lingering in the small garden behind the mansion, where Joan would sit and sketch in a notebook Gerald had given her. Watching the young girl flourish, Stephanie felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known since losing her own daughter. Joan's resilience inspired her, and her quiet determination to make Claire proud became a driving force in their bond. One afternoon, Stephanie joined Joan in the garden, holding a tray with 2 cups of tea. Joan looked up from her sketchbook, surprised but pleased. Stephanie sat beside her, the warmth of the sun softening her usually sharp features. "What are you drawing?" Stephanie asked, her tone curious rather than demanding. Joan held up the sketch, a simple but detailed drawing of the forest they had once called home. "It's where everything started," she said. "I don't want to forget it." Stephanie studied the drawing, her expression thoughtful. "You won't," she said firmly. "And neither will I." Joan smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. For the first time, she felt the weight of her loss ease, replaced by the steady foundation of a new beginning. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gerald joined them in the garden. The three of them sat together, the warmth of their connection weaving through the silence. Stephanie reached for Joan's hand, and Gerald placed his hand over both of theirs. "We're a family now," Gerald said, his voice resolute, "and we always will be." Joan looked at them both, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe. And, as the last light of day faded, she whispered a silent promise to her mother. "I'll be okay. I'll make you proud." The quiet hum of the car engine was the only sound as Gerald drove the winding road toward Forest Park. In the back seat, Joan clutched a bouquet of wildflowers, her fingers gently brushing the petals as her gaze lingered on the passing trees. Stephanie sat beside her, holding a second bouquet of roses, Claire's favorite. The golden light of sunset filtered through the trees as they arrived at the small clearing. The forest was alive with the soft rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds, yet it felt peaceful, almost sacred. Gerald parked the car, and the three stepped out, their shoes crunching softly on the dirt path that led to Claire's grave. Joan led the way, her steps steady despite the weight of the moment. She had visited this spot many times in her mind, replaying memories of her mother and the life they had shared in this forest. But standing here now, in the dappled light of the evening, it felt different, like a closing chapter, bittersweet, but necessary. When they reached the grave, Joan knelt, placing her bouquet on the carefully tended plot. The headstone was simple but elegant, engraved with Claire's name and a short inscription. A loving mother, brave and true. Joan traced the words with her fingers, her chest tightening. "Hi, Mum," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I'm back." Stephanie stood a few steps behind her, her usually composed demeanor softened by the solemnity of the moment. She moved forward, placing her roses gently beside Joan's bouquet. For a long moment, she simply stared at the grave, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, she spoke. "Claire," Stephanie began, her words slow and deliberate, "I didn't know you, but I owe you everything. You raised a daughter who's braver and kinder than I could ever hope to be." Her voice broke slightly, and she glanced at Joan before continuing. "I promise you, I'll protect her. I'll do everything in my power to honor the love you gave her." Joan looked up at Stephanie, her eyes wide with surprise. For all the tension and misunderstandings they had shared, this moment felt like a turning point. Stephanie's words were not just a promise to Claire, but an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond they now shared. As the sun dipped lower, painting the clearing in hues of amber and gold, Gerald placed a hand on Joan's shoulder. "You've made her proud," he said gently. "Everything you've done, everything you've become, she's proud of you, Joan." Joan nodded, her tears falling freely now. But they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of love, of gratitude, of a quiet peace settling in her heart. "I miss her," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I know she's still with me." "She always will be," Gerald said, his voice steady. "And so will we." Joan stood, brushing the dirt from her knees. She turned to Stephanie, her expression filled with something new. Trust. Stephanie reached out, hesitating for only a moment before pulling Joan into a gentle embrace. Joan leaned into her, finding comfort in the gesture. The three of them stood there for a while longer, the forest around them glowing in the fading light. It felt as though the trees themselves were bearing witness to their moment of unity, their branches swaying softly in approval. As they turned to leave, Joan glanced back at the grave one last time. "Goodbye, Mom," she whispered. "I love you." She took Gerald's hand in one of hers and Stephanie's in the other, their warmth anchoring her. Together they walked back through the forest, their steps unhurried and their hearts a little lighter. The path ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, Joan felt ready. She carried Claire's love with her, but she no longer carried it alone. Gerald and Stephanie were by her side, their promises to her and to Claire woven into every step they took. As the forest thinned and the car came into view, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight. But Joan didn't fear the darkness. She was no longer walking it alone. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.